the low deserts of southern Iraq, where the land stretches flat and colorless under an unforgiving sky, there are places where the earth feels unusually heavy, as if it is pressing down on something it does not want to release. Wind moves across these plains without obstruction, carrying sand, salt, and the faint echo of rivers that once flowed wider and slower than they do today. To the untrained eye, these places look empty. Broken mounds of mud brick rise gently from the ground, their edges softened by thousands of years of erosion. But beneath those mounds are cities that once pulsed with human life, cities that did not simply appear, but arrived with an unsettling sense of certainty, as if they already knew who they were supposed to be. And when those cities speak to us through the fragments they left behind, they do not sound like humanity taking its first uncertain steps. They sound like humanity already walking, already counting, already measuring, already remembering. This is where the story truly begins, not with invention, but with preservation. The oldest continuous writing system we know of did not emerge as poetry or philosophy. It emerged as record-keeping. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, each pressed with wedge-shaped marks made by a reed stylus, have been recovered from the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities like Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, and Lagash. These marks, known today as cuneiform, look deceptively simple, almost accidental, like bird tracks pressed into wet mud. Yet when scholars finally learned how to read them in the 19th century, they discovered something deeply unsettling. These tablets were not tentative experiments. They were not crude attempts to represent basic ideas. They were contracts, tax records, medical instructions, astronomical observations, hymns, school exercises, and legal rulings. They spoke the language of a society that already understood bureaucracy, mathematics, law, and time itself. Writing did not stumble into existence here. It arrived already useful, already specialized, already indispensable. This is strange, because writing systems are not supposed to work that way. In every other place where writing develops independently, there is a visible trail of experimentation. Early symbols are pictographic, literal, limited. Over centuries, they slowly abstract, simplify, and diversify. Mistakes accumulate. Competing systems rise and fall. You can watch the process unfold layer by layer in Egypt, in China, in Mesoamerica. But in southern Mesopotamia, that trail is missing. Cuneiform appears suddenly, capable of expressing complex administrative and abstract concepts almost immediately. The earliest tablets we have already assumed trained scribes, standardized symbols, and institutional continuity. It is as if writing was not being invented, but activated. The people who use this system are known to us as the Sumerians. And from the moment their name entered modern textbooks, historians were faced with a problem that has never been fully resolved. Sumerian civilization does not seem to grow gradually out of what came before it. It seems to appear. Around the late 4th millennium BCE, cities across southern Mesopotamia expand rapidly. Urban planning becomes sophisticated. Irrigation systems stretch for kilometers. Monumental temple platforms rise from the floodplain. Trade networks extend hundreds of miles. Mathematical systems based on the number 60 are already in place, systems we still use today to divide hours, minutes, and circles. This is not what the birth of a civilization is supposed to look like. There is no long rehearsal, no obvious learning curve. Sumer does not ease into history. It steps onto the stage already knowing its lines. For more than a century, scholars have tried to explain this anomaly. Some argue that earlier developmental stages simply have not been found, erased by flooding, buried beneath silt, or destroyed by time. Others suggest that Sumer inherited its knowledge from neighboring cultures whose archaeological traces are still hidden or lost. These explanations are possible, but they remain speculative. What makes the situation more intriguing is that the Sumerians themselves offer a very different explanation, one written clearly into their own records. Again and again, in temple inscriptions, king lists, and hymns, the same idea appears. What they were doing was not invention. It was restoration. Kingship, they wrote, descended from heaven. After the flood swept over the land, kingship was lowered from heaven again. Cities were rebuilt. Temples were restored. Ancient designs were carried forward from distant days. The language is consistent, and it is deliberate. The Sumerians did not describe themselves as pioneers standing at the dawn of civilization. They described themselves as caretakers, inheritors, and preservers of something far older. To understand how seriously they took this role, you have to imagine the physical act of writing itself. A Sumerian scribe would sit with a lump of damp clay shaped into a tablet. Using a reed stylus, they would press mark after mark into the surface, knowing that once the clay dried, those impressions would harden forever. Sometimes, in moments of distraction or haste, a thumb would brush the surface, leaving a fingerprint. Thousands of years later, those fingerprints are still there. The ridges and whorls of a human hand pressed into clay before the pyramids were built, before writing existed anywhere else on Earth. These were not casual marks. Writing on clay was slow, physical, and intentional. You did not write unless you believed what you were recording mattered. Among the tablets recovered from Sumerian cities are astronomical records that track the movements of Venus with astonishing accuracy. Medical texts that describe treatments using plant compounds still recognized today, and mathematical tables that teach students how to calculate square roots and compound interest. There are school exercises where young scribes copied multiplication tables again and again, learning a mathematical system that assumes a deep understanding of number theory. None of this looks like the early fumbling of a society just discovering literacy. It looks like the output of a culture already fluent in abstract thought, using writing as a tool to preserve and transmit knowledge that was already well developed, and threaded through all of it is memory. The Sumerians wrote about a time before a great flood, a division between an earlier world and their own. They described rulers who lived for impossibly long spans of time, cities that existed before the waters came, and divine figures who taught humanity how to measure, build, and organize the world. Modern readers tend to label these accounts as myth, and myth they may be, but dismissing them outright creates a problem. The Sumerians did not separate myth from history the way we do. Their king lists mix rulers whose existence is archaeologically confirmed with others whose reigns stretch tens of thousands of years. They did not mark where myth ended and history began. They presented the entire sequence as memory. What makes this especially unsettling is that archaeology has revealed evidence of a massive flood event in southern Mesopotamia around the same period the Sumerians described. Excavations at cities like Shuruppak, and Kish uncovered thick layers of sterile silt, separating earlier occupation layers from later ones. These were not the result of seasonal flooding. They were deposited rapidly by a catastrophic inundation that buried entire settlements. Above the flood layer, Sumerian civilization appears. Below it, traces of an earlier culture exist, largely erased, difficult to interpret, and often overlooked. For the people living in the river plains, this flood would have felt like the end of the world. Everything they knew lay submerged beneath water and mud. When the waters receded, survivors rebuilt on top of the ruins, carrying with them fragments of memory from a time before. If that is the case, then writing in Sumer may not have been born from curiosity or creativity alone. It may have been born from fear. Fear of forgetting. Fear that what survived the flood would be lost again. Writing becomes, in this light, a technology of memory, a way to anchor knowledge against the erasing force of catastrophe. Clay, after all, does not burn easily. When buildings caught fire, the tablets inside were baked harder, not destroyed. Floodwaters might collapse walls, but the tablets buried beneath would survive, waiting to be uncovered by someone thousands of years later. This durability is not accidental. It is almost poetic. Memory preserved by disaster itself. The deeper scholars look into early Sumerian texts, the more this pattern repeats. Temple inscriptions do not boast of innovation. They speak of ancient plans being restored. Legal codes are not framed as new laws, but as the re-establishment of proper order. Even scribal training texts emphasize preservation over creativity. Students are instructed to copy the words of their ancestors exactly, without alteration. Accuracy matters more than originality. This is not the mindset of a culture inventing itself. It is the mindset of a culture that believes something precious has already been lost once and must not be lost again. And yet, modern history has struggled to accept this self-description at face value. It is more comfortable to believe that the Sumerians exaggerated their antiquity, that claims of restoration were symbolic, meant to lend authority to new institutions. Perhaps that is true, but even if it is, the question remains. Why does Sumer look so different from every other early civilization? Why does its writing appear fully formed? Why does its knowledge seem inherited rather than developed? Why does its own literature insist, again and again, that what is being recorded is older than the people recording it? When you stand mentally at the edge of those deserts, imagining the silence broken only by wind, it becomes easier to understand why this question refuses to go away. Beneath the sand lie not just the remains of cities, but the remains of a worldview that does not align neatly with our modern timelines. The Sumerians did not see themselves at the dawn of history. They saw themselves after something had already ended. Their writing does not announce a beginning. It marks a boundary. On one side, a world remembered only in fragments, stories, and numbers too large to comprehend. On the other, a rebuilt world, trying desperately to hold on to what it could still recall. If this is true, then the first words humanity ever wrote were not meant to celebrate progress. They were meant to resist loss. They were not the opening line of civilization, but a final attempt to save its prologue. And as we move deeper into the clay archives of ancient Sumer, the question grows heavier, not lighter. What exactly were they trying to remember? And why did they believe it was so important that it be written down, pressed into mud, and left behind for us to find, long after the rivers changed course and the cities turned back into dust? In part 1, we stood at the threshold of writing itself, watching it emerge not as a fragile experiment, but as a fully functioning tool of memory. Now, in part 2, we have to move deeper, past the existence of the tablets and into what they actually say, because this is where the story becomes far more unsettling. Once the Sumerians began writing, they did not limit themselves to counting grain or recording labor. Almost immediately, they began organizing time, authority, and history itself. And the way they did this suggests they were not inventing a new world order, but trying to make sense of an old one that had been violently interrupted. Among the most important documents ever recovered from Mesopotamia is something that, at first glance, looks deceptively simple. It is known today as the Sumerian King List. Unlike myths or hymns, this text is structured like an administrative record. City by city, ruler by ruler, it lists who held kingship, how long they ruled, and where authority passed next. There is no poetry, no metaphor, no drama, just names, places, and numbers. And yet, this document has troubled historians for more than a century because the numbers it contains refuse to behave like history. The King List begins with a statement that sets the tone for everything that follows. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. This is not presented as symbolism, it is presented as fact. Kingship does not emerge from human society, negotiation, or conquest. It arrives, it descends. And the place it arrives first is Eridu, a city the Sumerians themselves regarded as the oldest of all cities. From there, the list proceeds to name 8 rulers who reigned before a great flood. Their reigns are measured not in years, but in tens of thousands of years. One king is said to have ruled for 28,800 years, another for 36,000. The total length of this pre-flood period exceeds 240,000 years. After these entries, the text pauses, and then comes a stark line that divides everything that follows. Then the flood swept over. After the flood, the king list continues, but everything changes. Kingship is lowered from heaven again, this time to the city of Kish. The rulers who follow have reigns that, while still exaggerated, fall within the realm of human possibility. Hundreds of years, decades. The structure of the list remains the same, but the scale collapses. It is as if time itself has been reset. For a long time, scholars dismissed the pre-flood section as pure mythology. a symbolic prologue before real history begins. This interpretation is convenient, but it creates a problem. The Sumerians did not label the pre-flood kings as gods. They listed them exactly the same way they listed later rulers. Same format, same tone, same administrative structure. If this was mythology, it was written in the language of accounting, not storytelling. And the scribes who copied the list centuries later treated the entire document with equal seriousness, even when they could no longer reconcile the numbers with lived experience. What makes this even more intriguing is the mathematics behind those impossible reigns. The numbers are not random. They are precise multiples of 3,600, a number known in Sumerian mathematics as a sar, a fundamental unit of large-scale time. The Sumerians used a base 60 system, and 3,600 is 60 times 60. When you break down the reigns of the pre-flood kings, they align perfectly with this system. This has led some researchers to suggest that the list may not be recording lifespans at all, but something else entirely. Cycles, epochs, measured periods of time tied to astronomy rather than biology. If this is true, then the king list stops being absurd and starts becoming cryptic. It may be preserving a chronology of deep time, expressed in a symbolic language that later generations continued to copy without fully understanding. The flood in this reading becomes the moment when that system of long-term timekeeping broke down, replaced by human-scale history, because the context that made the older system meaningful had been lost. This interpretation gains weight when we turn back to the ground itself. In the late 1920s, archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of when his team encountered something unexpected. Beneath layers of occupation debris, they hit a thick band of clean, sterile clay. No pottery, no tools, no signs of human activity. At first, Woolley thought they had reached virgin soil, but when he ordered the excavation to continue, artifacts appeared again below the clay layer. Human habitation, then a sudden deposit of flood silt, then human habitation again. Woolley found the same pattern at other sites, including Shuruppak and Kish. The flood described in Sumerian texts was not global, but it was real, and it was devastating enough to erase entire cities. For the people living in the Mesopotamian floodplain, this event would have been total. Fields, homes, temples, and archives destroyed. The survivors would have rebuilt on top of ruins they could barely see, carrying only what knowledge they could remember or salvage. This is where the king list takes on a different meaning. It is not a fantasy about immortal kings. It is a document trying to bridge a rupture, to connect a world before the flood with a world after it, using numbers and names as anchors. This pattern of rupture and restoration appears everywhere in Sumerian writing. Temple inscriptions repeatedly describe buildings not as new constructions, but as renewals of ancient foundations. Gods are said to return order to the land. Laws are framed as restorations of justice rather than innovations. Even writing itself is treated as something inherited. Scribal training texts emphasize copying ancient models exactly, preserving old forms rather than experimenting with new ones. Creativity is not valued. Fidelity is. All of this points to a culture that believed it was living after a fall. Not the beginning of history, but the aftermath of a collapse so severe that it divided time itself into before and after. The flood was not just a natural disaster, it was a memory boundary. On one side lay a world remembered only in fragments, numbers, and stories. On the other side stood the Sumerians, trying to reconstruct order from what survived. As we move forward, another mystery begins to take shape. If the Sumerians inherited their knowledge, their chronology, and even their sense of authority from an earlier world, then where did their language come from? Languages carry ancestry the way bones carry scars. They evolve, branch, and leave traces of their past. Yet Sumerian does not behave like a language with a visible lineage. It appears abruptly, fully formed and isolated, with no known relatives. To understand what that means, we have to listen not just to what the Sumerians wrote, but to the structure of the words themselves. because the language may be preserving a memory even older than the tablets that recorded it. If the King List suggests a rupture in time, then the Sumerian language itself suggests something even stranger, a rupture in ancestry. Languages normally behave like living organisms. They evolve slowly, split into families, borrow from neighbors, and leave behind traces of every stage they pass through. Linguists can usually follow these trails with remarkable precision, reconstructing parent languages that were never written down by comparing patterns that survive in their descendants. This is how Proto-Indo-European was identified, how Latin's transformation into the Romance languages was mapped, how ancient Chinese evolved from oracle bone inscriptions into modern scripts. Language remembers where it came from, even when people forget. But Sumerian does not behave like that. It appears in the historical record already complete, already structured, and with no clear relatives anywhere on Earth. When Sumerian first appears in writing around 3300 BCE, it is not primitive. Its grammar is complex, its vocabulary rich, its ability to express abstract ideas fully developed. Linguists classify it as an agglutinative language, meaning it builds meaning by attaching strings of prefixes and suffixes to root words. A single Sumerian word can encode what English would need an entire sentence to express. This kind of linguistic sophistication normally emerges after long periods of use, adaptation, and refinement. Yet there are no earlier stages preserved. There is no Proto-Sumerian. There are no half-formed inscriptions showing scribes experimenting with grammar or struggling to express complex ideas. Sumerian arrives whole. Even more puzzling is the fact that it has no known linguistic family. It does not resemble the Semitic languages that later dominated Mesopotamia, such as Akkadian, Babylonian, or Assyrian. Those languages operate on completely different principles, built around consonantal roots rather than layered suffixes. Nor does Sumerian clearly connect to Indo-European, Dravidian, Uralic, Caucasian, or any other major language group. For over a century, linguists have searched for relatives, proposing connections, testing them, and discarding them when the evidence fails to hold. Today, Sumerian is classified as a language isolate, a linguistic orphan with no identifiable parents or siblings. This alone would be remarkable, but the context makes it unsettling. Language isolates usually survive in marginal regions, spoken by small populations that escaped assimilation. Basque in Europe is a classic example, preserved in mountainous terrain while surrounding languages changed. But Sumerian was not marginal. It was the administrative, religious, and intellectual language of the most advanced civilization of its time. Its isolation does not come from geographical protection. It comes from absence, as if every other language related to it vanished, leaving Sumerian alone on the surface of history. One possible explanation is that Sumerian represents the last surviving branch of a much older language family that disappeared entirely. If so, that disappearance must have been catastrophic, wiping out not just populations, but their linguistic descendants. The timing matters here. The earliest written Sumerian appears only a few centuries after the flood layers identified in southern Mesopotamia. If Sumerian was already being spoken before that catastrophe, then the flood could explain why its linguistic relatives are missing. They may lie buried beneath silt, beneath drowned landscapes, or beneath memories that never made it into writing. This possibility is reinforced by the way Sumerians themselves treated their language. Even after Akkadian became the dominant spoken language of Mesopotamia around 2500 BCE, Sumerian did not disappear. It stopped being spoken in daily life, but it remained central to scholarship, religion, and law for more than 1,000 years. Scribes continued to learn it in schools. Temples continued to use it in rituals. Kings commissioned inscriptions in Sumerian to legitimize their rule. Eventually, bilingual dictionaries were created, pairing Sumerian words with Akkadian translations, because the language was no longer intuitive, yet still considered essential. Sumerian became a sacred language, not because it was new, but because it was old. This is the opposite of what we would expect if Sumerian were simply the product of a newly emerging civilization. New cultures usually abandon old forms in favor of more efficient ones. They innovate, they simplify, they adapt. But Mesopotamian scribes clung to Sumerian long after it ceased to be useful for everyday communication. They treated it as a vessel of ancient wisdom, a key to knowledge that could not be accessed any other way. One Babylonian scribe wrote that the ancient words must not be altered because they carried understanding from before a great change. The text does not explain what that change was. It assumes the reader already knows. Language, then, becomes another layer of memory. Not just what was said, but how it was said. Grammar itself preserving a fossil record of thought patterns shaped in a world that no longer existed. If Sumerian carries traces of an older linguistic substrate, a language spoken before it, then its very structure may be preserving echoes of a pre-flood society. A society that spoke, organized, and conceptualized reality in ways that survived only partially, frozen into grammar and ritual. This brings us back to the content of Sumerian texts themselves, because what they describe aligns disturbingly well with this idea of inheritance rather than invention. Sumerian myths do not present creation as effortless or instantaneous. They describe process. They describe labor, conflict, planning, and adjustment. In the Atrahasis epic and related creation texts, humans are not spoken into existence. They are assembled. Clay is mixed with divine essence. Multiple attempts are made. Some creations are flawed. Adjustments are introduced. Only after iteration does a stable human population emerge. This is not the language of spontaneous mythic imagination. It is the language of observation translated into symbolism. Modern readers tend to interpret these stories metaphorically, as philosophical reflections on human imperfection or social roles. That interpretation is reasonable, but it does not explain the procedural nature of the narratives. Step follows step. Cause follows effect. Failure leads to redesign. These are the hallmarks of technical description, not pure allegory. If the Sumerians were encoding knowledge they did not fully understand, myth would be the only available container. Gods become stand-ins for agents. Divine blood becomes a placeholder for whatever animating principle they observed, but could not explain. Clay becomes matter. The story survives because the structure matters more than the literal meaning. Across the world, similar figures appear in cultures with no known contact. Beings who arrive after catastrophe, teach agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, law, and architecture, and then withdraw. In Egypt, the Netjeru. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent. In India, the Devas. In later Near Eastern texts, the Watchers. Different names, different costumes, but the same function. Teachers, organizers, civilizers. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, and in their texts, these beings are not distant abstractions. They argue, they make mistakes, they regret decisions, they work, they get tired, they need help. They feel less like eternal gods and more like remembered authorities, whose stature grew as memory faded. If we step back and look at the pattern without forcing it into modern categories, a different picture begins to emerge. One in which Sumer is not the birthplace of civilization, but a refuge of it. A place where fragments of an older world were gathered, stabilized, and preserved. Writing becomes the tool that allows this preservation to outlast living memory. Language becomes the vessel that carries forward patterns of thought from a drowned past. Myth becomes the archive of processes that could no longer be described directly. None of this requires us to accept literal immortals or supernatural interventions. It requires only that we take the Sumerians seriously when they say they were restoring something, not inventing it, that they lived in the shadow of a catastrophe large enough to erase context while leaving fragments intact, that they wrote not to announce a beginning, but to prevent a second forgetting. As we move forward, the focus shifts from language and memory to the figures the Sumerians believed stood behind their knowledge. The Anunnaki are not just characters in stories. They are woven into law, kingship, astronomy, and the structure of society itself. To understand what the Sumerians thought they had inherited, we must now examine who these teachers were believed to be, and why their presence appears so consistently across the earliest records of human civilization. The Anunnaki sit at the center of the Sumerian worldview, not as distant, unknowable gods, but as organizing agents of reality itself. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not merely objects of worship. They were administrators, judges, engineers of order. Their presence is embedded in legal formulas, astronomical texts, temple inscriptions, and royal titles. They are invoked when boundaries are set, when cities are founded, when kings are crowned. In other words, wherever structure appears in Sumerian civilization, the Anunnaki are said to stand behind it. This is important because it tells us how the Sumerians understood their own place in history. They did not see themselves as the highest authority. Kings ruled, but kingship itself was not human property. Kingship descended from heaven, the texts say, and when it failed, it could be taken back. Authority did not originate from conquest or invention, but from transmission. Someone gave it, someone else received it. This framing makes sense if Sumerian society believed it was inheriting a system rather than creating one. The Anunnaki are consistently portrayed as operating through councils. Decisions are debated, votes are taken, consequences are weighed. In the flood narratives, the gods argue about whether humanity should be destroyed. Some push for annihilation, others object. Enki, the god of wisdom, repeatedly acts against the consensus to preserve life. This is not the behavior of abstract cosmic forces. It is the behavior of political actors, bureaucratic actors, beings accustomed to governance. Even more striking is how often the Anunnaki are associated with specific domains of technical knowledge. Enki is credited with teaching writing, mathematics, irrigation, and craftsmanship. Inanna governs cycles of Venus and warfare strategy. Utu oversees law and justice, tied directly to the movement of the sun. Enlil controls atmospheric forces and agricultural productivity. These are not vague spiritual portfolios. They map cleanly onto the core systems that make civilization function. Water management, timekeeping, law, food production, infrastructure. If these were purely symbolic deities invented by an early farming society, we would expect their attributes to reflect basic human concerns: fertility, weather, survival. Instead, we see specialization, technical division of labor, knowledge domains that mirror administrative reality. This suggests the Anunnaki myths emerged in a context where complex systems already existed and where those systems were attributed to earlier authorities whose memory had become mythologized. The Sumerian King List reinforces this interpretation. Early kings are described as ruling in partnership with the gods, sometimes as their literal offspring. These hybrid lineages blur the boundary between divine and human, suggesting a remembered hierarchy where certain individuals possessed authority and knowledge far beyond the general population. Over time, as generations passed and explanations faded, those individuals were elevated into gods, their human qualities amplified, their limitations erased. This process is not unique to Sumer. Across the ancient world, we see the same pattern. In Egypt, the earliest dynasties claimed descent from the gods who ruled before the pharaohs. In Mesoamerica, early rulers traced their legitimacy to sky beings who taught calendrics and architecture. In China, legendary sage kings are described as semi-divine figures who established writing, agriculture, and law in a distant golden age. These traditions do not emerge from ignorance. They emerge from memory stretched across time. What makes the Sumerian case different is writing. Sumer is the first place where these memories were fixed into durable form. Clay tablets do not decay like papyrus. They do not burn like wood. Catastrophe hardens them. Floods bury them safely. Fires bake them into ceramics. Sumerian memory survived precisely because it was recorded in the most resilient medium available. This means we are not dealing with oral myths distorted beyond recognition. We are dealing with texts copied carefully across centuries, standardized, preserved, and taught in scribal schools. Errors were corrected. Variants were compared. There was an active effort to maintain fidelity to the original words. When later Akkadian scribes encountered passages they no longer understood, they did not replace them. They annotated them. They translated them. They preserved them anyway. Why preserve something you no longer fully understand? Because you believe it matters. Because you believe it came from a time when people knew more than you do. This belief runs through Mesopotamian culture like a fault line. Progress, in the modern sense, is not assumed. The past is not primitive. The past is superior. The goal is not innovation, but recovery. This inversion of our usual historical narrative is deeply uncomfortable. We are used to thinking of history as a climb from ignorance to knowledge. Sumerian texts suggest something else, a fall from knowledge into recovery, a break, a loss, a rebuilding. The flood is the symbol of that break, but it may not be the only one. The flood represents disruption so total that it resets social order, language families, and systems of transmission. If an advanced culture existed before the flood, it does not need to resemble modern civilization to have been sophisticated. Sophistication is not skyscrapers or electronics. It is systems. It is long-term planning. It is mathematical abstraction. It is astronomical observation. It is the ability to coordinate large populations and preserve knowledge across generations. All of these are present in Sumer, without evidence of local development, which suggests they were carried forward. At this point, the question is no longer whether Sumer was advanced. That is beyond dispute. The question is whether Sumer was first. And the cumulative evidence increasingly points to no. Sumer looks less like a beginning and more like a bottleneck, a narrowing of history where vast amounts of prior context were lost, leaving behind fragments that had to be stabilized quickly in order to survive. Writing emerges in this context not as a luxury, but as an emergency measure, a way to freeze memory before it vanished. Administrative tablets record rations and inventories, not because bureaucracy was exciting, but because survival required organization. Mythological tablets encode processes and origins, not because imagination ran wild, but because memory needed a container. The King List encodes time, not because numbers were impressive, but because chronology had to be preserved across a rupture that erased lived experience. Seen this way, Sumerian civilization begins to look like a recovery operation, a society under pressure to rebuild complexity as fast as possible, using whatever fragments remained. This would explain the urgency, the completeness, the lack of experimentation. When you are inventing something new, you try things. When you are restoring something old, you follow instructions. And instructions are exactly what Sumerian texts claim to contain. Divine decrees, ancient designs, plans laid down in distant days. The language is consistent. The message is consistent. We are not the first. We are the ones who remember. If that is true, then the real mystery lies not in Sumer, but beneath it, in the layers of silt and sea level rise that separate us from whatever came before, in the coastal plains now underwater, in the river valleys reshaped by catastrophe, in the silence between the end of the last ice age and the first wedge pressed into clay. To move closer to an answer, we must now leave myth and language and turn to the earth itself, to climate, geology, and the timeline of catastrophe that reshaped the planet. Because if Sumer preserved memory of a lost world, that world must have existed in a place and time that can still be traced in the scars of the earth. To understand whether the Sumerians were preserving the memory of a lost world, we have to step outside temples and tablets and look at the planet itself, because civilizations do not rise or fall in isolation from climate. They are shaped, constrained, and sometimes erased by forces far larger than any king or city. When we examine the geological record alongside Sumerian memory, an uncomfortable alignment begins to appear, one that suggests the flood they described was not an isolated myth, but part of a much larger global transformation. At the end of the last ice age, roughly between 12,000 and 9,000 BCE, the Earth underwent one of the most dramatic environmental shifts in its history. Massive ice sheets that had covered large portions of North America, Europe, and Asia began to melt rapidly. As they collapsed, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters worldwide. This was not a slow, gentle change. In some periods, sea levels rose several meters per century, fast enough to drown entire coastlines within a human lifetime. Vast stretches of land that had once been habitable disappeared beneath the oceans. River systems were rerouted, coastal plains vanished, ecosystems collapsed and reformed. For modern humans, whose civilizations are built inland and recorded in writing, this event feels abstract. But for people living at the time, it would have been existential. The most fertile areas on Earth during the Ice Age were not deserts or mountains, but coastal shelves and river deltas, places now underwater. These regions offered abundant food, stable climates, and easy transportation. If complex human societies existed before the end of the Ice Age, these are exactly the places they would have settled. And these are exactly the places we can no longer easily investigate. This is where the archaeological silence becomes meaningful. We find sudden appearances of advanced cultures shortly after this period, not just in Mesopotamia, but across the world. In Anatolia, Göbekli Tepe emerges around 9600 BCE, a monumental stone complex built by hunter-gatherers who supposedly lacked agriculture, metallurgy, or social hierarchy. Yet its pillars weigh up to 20 tons, carved with sophisticated symbolism and aligned with celestial patterns. There is no evidence of gradual development leading up to it. It appears fully formed, then is deliberately buried and abandoned. In the Levant, the Natufian culture shows early sedentary life before agriculture, followed by disruption and reorganization. In the Indus region, early settlement patterns suggest long gaps between habitation layers. In the Americas, Clovis culture appears abruptly, with advanced tool technology and rapid continental spread, followed by a sudden decline coinciding with climatic upheaval. Everywhere we look around this time, we see the same pattern: emergence, disruption, reset. This global instability is now increasingly associated with an event known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions around 10,800 BCE that lasted over 1,000 years. Temperatures dropped sharply, rainfall patterns shifted, many large animal species went extinct, human populations were forced to adapt rapidly or perish. Some researchers argue this period may have been triggered or intensified by cosmic impacts, possibly fragments of a comet striking the Earth, causing widespread fires, flooding, and atmospheric disruption. While this hypothesis remains debated, the evidence for sudden, catastrophic change is strong. What matters here is not the exact cause, but the effect. Human continuity was broken. Knowledge transmission was disrupted. Societies that may have existed along coasts and fertile plains were erased. Survivors would have fled inland, carrying fragments of memory, but losing the physical infrastructure that supported their way of life. Over generations, these memories would blur, compress, and mythologize, but certain core truths would remain. The world changed suddenly, water rose, and everything that had been built was lost. This is precisely the structure of the flood stories preserved by the Sumerians. They do not describe a gentle inundation. They describe a total reset, a before and an after. A world where knowledge existed, followed by a world where that knowledge had to be recovered. The flood in the Sumerian texts does not come out of nowhere. It is anticipated, warned about, prepared for by a chosen survivor who preserves seeds, animals, and instructions for rebuilding. This is not how purely symbolic myths behave. It is how survival memories behave. When archaeology later confirms a massive flood layer in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE, it does not contradict this deeper memory. It reinforces it. That flood may have been a regional echo of a much older pattern, a reminder embedded into cultural memory that water ends worlds. The Sumerians did not claim their flood was the first. They treated it as the most recent. Seen through this lens, Sumer becomes the inheritor of a post-cataclysmic world. a civilization arising not at the dawn of humanity, but at the dawn of recovery. Writing emerges not because people suddenly became clever, but because memory was at risk of vanishing. Complex systems reappear quickly because they were not invented from scratch. They were reconstructed using inherited templates, traditions, and rules whose origins were already ancient. This also explains why Sumerian culture places such emphasis on continuity, restoration, and preservation. Why scribes were trained to copy texts exactly, not improve them. Why kings claimed legitimacy by restoring ancient order rather than creating new laws. Why temples were rebuilt on old foundations, even when it would have been easier to start elsewhere. These behaviors make sense for a society that believes it is living in the shadow of a lost golden age. The earth itself supports this reading. Beneath today's oceans lie drowned river valleys, submerged cities, and unexplored continental shelves. Technologies now allow us to map these landscapes, and what we are finding is not empty seafloor, but complex terrain shaped by rivers, lakes, and human-friendly environments. We have barely begun to investigate them, but if traces of earlier civilizations exist, this is where they will be found. The Sumerians did not have geology or climate science. They did not know about ice sheets or sea level curves, but they knew something had been lost. They knew knowledge came from before. They knew the world had ended and restarted. They encoded that knowledge in lists, myths, rituals, and numbers, and they trusted clay to carry it forward. At this point, the question shifts again. If environmental catastrophe erased an earlier world, and if Sumer preserved fragments of its knowledge, then what kind of beings were capable of sustaining civilization before the flood? Were they anatomically modern humans like us? Or were they something else entirely, remembered as gods because their capabilities seemed impossible to later generations? To explore that, we must now look not at climate or myth, but at humanity itself, its evolution, its sudden leaps, and the unanswered questions hidden in our own origins. If catastrophe erased an earlier world, then the most unsettling question is not what was lost, but who lived there. To confront that, we have to turn inward, away from tablets and floods, and toward humanity itself. Because when we examine human evolution closely, the story is far less smooth and confident than textbooks suggest. Instead of a steady climb, we find gaps, jumps, and moments where something seems to accelerate far faster than biology alone should allow. Anatomically, modern humans appear in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. For most of that time, behavior remains relatively simple. Stone tools improve slowly. Social structures remain small. Symbolic thinking exists, but is limited. Then, around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, something changes. Suddenly, humans begin creating art, complex tools, long-distance trade networks, ritual burials, and symbolic objects. Language explodes in complexity. This period is often called the cognitive revolution, but that phrase is a placeholder, not an explanation. We do not know why it happened or what triggered it. What makes this more confusing is timing. Anatomical modernity appears hundreds of thousands of years before behavioral modernity. The hardware exists long before the software activates. For tens of thousands of years, humans have brains capable of abstract thought, yet they do not use them in the ways we recognize as civilization. Then, in a relatively short window, everything changes. Culture accelerates. Knowledge compounds. Humanity becomes something recognizably like us. This pattern raises uncomfortable questions. If biology alone explains civilization, why the delay? Why does symbolic complexity emerge so late and so suddenly? Why do advanced behaviors appear almost simultaneously across wide geographic regions? These questions do not have satisfying answers within standard evolutionary models. Adding to this mystery is the fact that early human populations were not alone. Until relatively recently, Earth was home to multiple intelligent hominin species. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, and others shared the planet with early Homo sapiens. Some of these species had large brains, complex tool use, and evidence of symbolic behavior. Genetic evidence now confirms that modern humans interbred with them. Our DNA carries their legacy. Human evolution is not a straight line, it is a braided river, yet all of these species disappear except us. By around 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens stands alone. The reasons are debated: climate change, competition, assimilation. But again, the pattern is abrupt. Multiple intelligent lineages vanish in a geological instant. One remains, and that one begins to behave very differently. Now consider this in light of Sumerian memory. The Sumerians describe a time before the flood, when rulers reigned for impossibly long spans, when knowledge flowed freely, when beings they called gods interacted directly with humanity. We dismiss this because it conflicts with modern categories. But what if the memory is distorted, not fabricated? What if the gods represent not supernatural beings, but a class of humans whose knowledge, lifespan, or social organization set them apart so completely that later societies could only describe them as divine? Longevity myths, for example, appear everywhere in ancient traditions. The Sumerian King List speaks of reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. Biblical patriarchs live for centuries. Hindu texts describe sages who span entire ages. These numbers are usually dismissed as symbolic, but they may encode something else: lineage duration, dynastic continuity, or the memory of populations that lived under conditions very different from ours. If environmental stability before the end of the Ice Age allowed longer lifespans, lower disease burden, and sustained knowledge transmission, later generations might remember that era as one of extraordinary longevity. There is also the question of knowledge density. A small population with highly specialized roles and long-term continuity can accumulate expertise that appears miraculous to later, fragmented societies. If such a population survived for millennia in stable coastal environments, then lost their infrastructure to rising seas, the survivors would appear as teachers, not peers, to post-cataclysmic groups. Over time, memory would elevate them into gods. This would explain why the Anunnaki are not creators of humanity in a cosmic sense, but organizers, instructors, and administrators. They do not invent the world. They manage it. They establish systems. They assign labor. They regulate cycles. These are not the acts of omnipotent deities. They are the acts of advanced planners operating within constraints. It would also explain why Sumerian myths include error and regret. The gods make mistakes. They miscalculate. They respond to unintended consequences. These are not traits of perfect beings. They are traits of intelligent but limited actors. Humans with power, not metaphysical absolutes. From this perspective, the flood becomes not divine punishment, but ecological collapse. Rising waters destroy the centers of knowledge. Survivors scatter. Some retain fragments of language, mathematics, astronomy. Most lose context. Over generations, instruction becomes ritual. Memory becomes myth. The teachers become gods. The archaeological record does not contradict this. It simply lacks the data because the most likely locations of pre-flood civilization are now underwater. Coastal shelves, river mouths, and deltas that would have supported dense populations are submerged beneath tens of meters of ocean. We have explored only a tiny fraction of them. What we have found so far submerge stone structures, ancient shorelines, and human activity dating back far earlier than expected suggests absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Human evolution, then, may not be the story of slow ascent we tell ourselves. It may include rises and collapses we have barely begun to recognize. Sumer stands at the edge of that recognition, the first society to record memory after the reset. Not because they were the first humans to think deeply, but because they were the first to write after forgetting became a threat. As we move toward the end of this journey, the pieces begin to align. A planet reshaped by catastrophe, a species capable of rapid cultural acceleration, a civilization that appears fully formed and insists it is restoring something older, a memory of teachers, organizers, and knowledge givers who vanish after a flood. What remains is the question that ties everything together. If Sumer was preserving the memory of a lost world, what was the purpose of that preservation? And what were they trying to warn us about? To answer that, we must return one final time to the clay, to the act of writing itself, and to the quiet intention behind the oldest words humanity ever pressed into wet earth. Part 7 brings us back to the moment that matters most, the moment when memory becomes deliberate. Writing did not emerge in Sumer as an artistic expression or a philosophical exercise. It emerged as an act of preservation. The earliest tablets are practical to the point of austerity. Lists of goods, measurements of grain, records of labor. But beneath this surface practicality lies something far more profound. Writing appears at the exact point where memory alone is no longer trusted. Oral tradition can carry stories across generations, but it is fragile, it bends, it forgets details, it reshapes meaning. A society that believes it is living after a collapse cannot rely on memory alone. It needs anchors, fixed points, something that survives fire, flood, and time. The Sumerians chose clay for a reason. Clay is everywhere in southern Mesopotamia. It is cheap, it is humble. But when baked, intentionally or accidentally, it becomes nearly eternal. The very disasters that destroy cities preserve their records. This choice tells us something about intent. The Sumerians were not writing for themselves alone. They were writing for the future, for people they would never meet, people who would not remember what they remembered. This is why their texts are repetitive, why formulas appear again and again, why phrases like "from distant days" and "this is the restoration of what was before" recur obsessively. Repetition is not redundancy, it is reinforcement. A message meant to survive misunderstanding. Look closely at how Sumerian scribes were trained. In the Adaba, the scribal school, students did not learn by composing new texts. They learned by copying old ones, line by line, sign by sign. Mistakes were corrected, deviations punished, creativity was discouraged, accuracy was sacred. This is not how a culture behaves when it believes it is inventing something new. This is how a culture behaves when it believes the original matters more than the present. Even myths were treated this way. The Epic of Gilgamesh exists in multiple versions, but its core structure remains stable across centuries. When later Babylonian scribes updated language or added reflections, they preserved the older layers alongside the new. They did not erase, they accumulated. They treated the past as authoritative, even when it was opaque. And what is Gilgamesh about, at its core? Not heroism, not conquest. It is about loss, about the death of a companion, about the fear of mortality, about a journey to find someone who survived the flood and learned the secret of eternal life. Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, is not a god. He is a man who lived before the waters came and was changed by surviving them. Gilgamesh does not succeed in gaining immortality. He returns with something else, a warning, a story, the knowledge that even greatness fades, but memory can endure. This theme runs through everything the Sumerians left behind. They were obsessed with boundaries, between before and after, between gods and humans, between order and chaos, between memory and forgetting. Writing was the tool that held those boundaries in place. If we accept this, then the earliest tablets take on a different meaning. They are not the birth certificate of civilization. They are its emergency archive. The moment when humanity realized that something precious had already been lost once, and that it could be lost again. This also explains why Sumerian texts are so strangely impersonal. The scribes rarely speak in the first person. They do not tell us how they feel. They tell us what must be done, what was done before, and what must be preserved. Their emotional world is encoded indirectly in the urgency of repetition and the fear of deviation. We tend to romanticize the past as naive. The Sumerians were not naive. They were cautious. They had inherited a warning, and they took it seriously. The flood was not just a disaster. It was proof that the world can reset without asking permission. That knowledge can vanish. That civilization is fragile. And this is the final thread that ties everything together. The Sumerians did not believe history was a straight line. They believed it was cyclical. Kingship descends, it fails. It descends again. Order is established. Chaos returns. Restoration follows. This cycle appears in their astronomy, their theology, their politics, and their myths. It is the worldview of a people who have seen continuity break. If that worldview is correct, then the purpose of Sumerian writing was not to glorify the present, but to speak to the future, to us, to anyone who would live long enough after the flood to forget what it meant. We are now at that point. We live in a world that assumes progress is inevitable. That knowledge only accumulates. That collapse is temporary and local. The Sumerians would have disagreed. Their entire civilization was built on the assumption that collapse is real, global, and recurring. In the final sections, we will step back and look at what this ancient warning might mean for us. Not as myth, not as speculation, but as a message deliberately sent across deep time, written in clay by people who believed they were not at the beginning of history, but somewhere in the middle, trying desperately to make sure the story did not end with them. Part 8 forces us to confront the implication the Sumerians never spelled out directly, but structured everything around. If history is cyclical, if knowledge can rise, fall, and rise again, then civilization is not a permanent achievement. It is a temporary state, something that must be actively maintained, remembered, and defended against forces far larger than politics or war. The Sumerians understood this, and it shaped how they thought about the future in ways that feel unsettlingly familiar today. In Sumerian thought, collapse was not hypothetical. It had already happened. The flood was proof. The ruins beneath their cities were proof. The fragments of older traditions embedded in their language, myths, and numbers were proof. Because of this, their worldview lacked the optimism we associate with progress. They did not assume tomorrow would be better than today. They assumed tomorrow depended entirely on whether order could be preserved. This is why Sumerian texts are so deeply concerned with balance. Balance between humans and gods, between cities and nature, between labor and reward. When balance fails, disaster follows. In the Atrahasis epic, humanity is nearly wiped out, not because it is evil, but because it becomes too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive to the system. The gods respond not out of malice, but out of miscalculation. They try plague, they try famine, they try drought. Each time, Enki intervenes to preserve humanity by adjusting the system. The flood is the final catastrophic correction when all previous controls fail. This is not a moral story. It is a system story, a warning about thresholds, about what happens when complex systems exceed their limits. Modern readers tend to project ethics onto it, but the Sumerians were describing something colder and more frightening. Collapse does not require evil intent. It requires imbalance. What makes this resonate today is how modern civilization mirrors the same assumptions Sumer warned against. We build as if resources are infinite. We organize as if systems will self-correct. We store knowledge digitally, assuming permanence. Yet digital memory is fragile. One solar storm, one global failure, and vast amounts of information vanish. Clay tablets survived fire and flood. Hard drives may not. The Sumerians trusted clay because they did not trust the world. They had already seen what the world could do. Their obsession with astronomy also takes on new meaning here. The sky to them was not just divine. It was predictable, cyclical. The movements of planets and stars offered reassurance that not everything was chaotic. Venus disappears and returns. Eclipses repeat. The heavens follow patterns even when the earth does not. This is why celestial cycles are embedded into their timekeeping, their kingship, and even their myths. Cosmic order was the model they tried to impose on human society, but even the sky was not eternal in their worldview. Celestial omens warned of disruption. Eclipses signaled danger to kings. Unusual planetary alignments were signs of upheaval. Nothing was guaranteed. Everything required attention. If we step back, the Sumerian message becomes clearer. They were not trying to tell us who the gods were, or whether they literally descended from heaven. They were trying to tell us that civilization is fragile, memory is precious, and forgetting is fatal. The gods are not the point. The flood is not the point. The point is what happens when continuity breaks. This reframes the entire question of human origins. Instead of asking, how did civilization begin? The Sumerians force us to ask, how many times has it ended? And more uncomfortably, are we heading toward another break? They believed they were living after the fall of a previous world. We believe we are living at the peak of progress. That difference matters. If Sumer is a warning encoded in clay, then the warning is not about ancient gods or lost continents. It is about complacency, about assuming that knowledge, once gained, cannot be lost, about assuming that systems designed for stability cannot collapse, about assuming that the future will resemble the past. The Sumerians knew better. They built cities knowing cities could drown. They wrote laws knowing law could fail. They tracked stars knowing the sky would outlast them. And they wrote because they feared that without writing, everything they knew would disappear the way everything before them had. As we approach the final part, only one question remains. If the Sumerians were trying to speak across time, if their civilization was a message rather than a beginning, then what are we supposed to do with that message now? Part 9 brings everything to its sharpest edge, because once you accept that Sumer may represent a restoration rather than a beginning, the question is no longer academic. It becomes existential. If civilization has collapsed before, then the real mystery is not how knowledge first appeared, but how it survived at all, and whether it can survive again. The Sumerians lived with the constant awareness that they were standing on ruins. Not metaphorical ruins, but literal ones. Beneath their temples lay older foundations. Beneath their cities lay buried streets. Beneath their myths lay memories of a time they no longer fully understood. This awareness produced a culture obsessed with preservation rather than expansion. They were not chasing novelty. They were guarding continuity. This is why scribal culture mattered so much. Writing was not just administration. It was defense against forgetting. Scribes were trained for years to copy texts exactly, without creativity, without interpretation. Errors were corrected. Variations were discouraged. Accuracy was sacred. In modern terms, they were archivists guarding a failing hard drive of civilization. One Sumerian proverb captures this mindset with chilling clarity. A city without records is a city without memory. Memory to them was not nostalgia. It was survival. This also explains why later civilizations clung to Sumerian knowledge long after the Sumerians themselves vanished. Babylon, Assyria, even Persia inherited Sumerian texts and treated them as ancient authority. They did not see Sumer as primitive. They saw it as foundational. When Babylonian scribes copied Sumerian hymns, they were not indulging tradition. They were maintaining access to a deeper past. And yet, even with all this effort, much was lost. We can see the loss in what later cultures misunderstood. The numbers in the King List were copied, but their meaning faded. The language survived in ritual, but no one spoke it fluently. The gods were worshipped, but no longer understood as teachers. Memory survived, but context eroded. This is what cultural amnesia looks like. Not total erasure, but distortion. Facts turn into symbols. Events turn into myths. Teachers turn into gods. Over enough time, no one remembers which parts were literal and which were metaphorical, because that distinction itself depended on knowledge that no longer exists. We are likely living inside the same process now. Modern civilization assumes that information automatically accumulates, that each generation inherits more than the last. That collapse is something that happens to others, in other times, under less advanced conditions. The Sumerians would have recognized this arrogance immediately. They had seen what water, climate, and systemic failure could do to the most advanced society of their age. What unsettles modern scholars is not that Sumer was advanced, but that it behaved like a post-collapse culture. Its fixation on order, its fear of imbalance, its reverence for ancient knowledge, its reluctance to claim innovation. These are not the traits of a civilization at the dawn of progress. They are the traits of one that knows what has already been lost. If this interpretation is correct, then the so-called gods become less important than the role they play in memory. They are placeholders for forgotten actors, whether those actors were an earlier human civilization, a global coastal culture erased by rising seas, or something more controversial does not change the underlying pattern. Knowledge existed, disaster intervened. Survivors remembered fragments. Writing froze those fragments in clay. The most uncomfortable implication is that progress may not be linear at all. It may be episodic, rising, collapsing, fragmenting, and restarting under new names, each cycle mistaking itself for the first. This would explain why so many ancient cultures describe previous worlds, not metaphorical ages, but literal eras that ended violently. Floods, fire, darkness, each reset followed by teachers, lawgivers, and civilizers who restore order, not invent it. From this perspective, Sumer is not the origin of civilization. It is the earliest warning sign we still have access to, a warning that knowledge is fragile, that memory requires effort, that collapse does not announce itself, and that when it comes, what survives will not be the strongest cities or the tallest monuments, but whatever can endure destruction by accident, by fire, by water, by time. Clay survived, stone survived, stories survived. The rest vanished. As we move toward the final section, the focus shifts from ancient Mesopotamia to us. Because if the Sumerians were correct, if they were recording the aftermath of a forgotten catastrophe, then the most important question is no longer what happened to them. It is whether we are doing any better at remembering than they did. By the time the Sumerians were pressing reeds into wet clay, they already believed they were living after an ending. Not at the dawn of humanity's story, but somewhere in the middle of it. Their writing was not an act of discovery, it was an act of preservation. Every tablet, whether it recorded grain rations or the movements of Venus, carried the same quiet urgency. This must not be forgotten again. When later civilizations inherited Sumerian knowledge, they inherited the tools but lost the context. Babylon kept the mathematics, but turned the gods into symbols. Egypt kept the alignments, but wrapped them in eternity and divine kingship. Greece kept the geometry, but stripped away the memory of catastrophe. Rome kept the laws, but forgot why order mattered so deeply. Each generation carried fragments forward, polishing them, reinterpreting them, slowly drifting further from the original reason they existed at all. This is why the story feels incomplete when read through modern eyes. We are looking at the ruins of a memory system without understanding the fear that created it. To the Sumerians, the world was not stable. The sky could change. The rivers could rise without warning. The gods could leave. Civilization was something that had already been lost once, and that knowledge shaped everything they built afterward. Their gods were not distant creators. They were remembered authorities. Their myths were not entertainment. They were compressed history, simplified enough to survive centuries of retelling. Their numbers were not decorative. They encoded cycles larger than a single lifetime. Their kings were not founders. They were placeholders, caretakers of an order that predated them. And their language, isolated and alone, reads like the last surviving dialect of a drowned world. If we step back far enough, a pattern emerges that extends beyond Sumer. Across the planet, the earliest complex societies share the same strange characteristics. Sudden sophistication, advanced knowledge without visible trial and error, myths of teachers who arrived after disaster, flood stories that divide time into before and after, sacred languages preserved long after they were spoken, monumental architecture aligned to skies that no longer looked the same. This does not point to a single simple answer. It points to recurrence. Civilization may not be a straight ascent from ignorance to enlightenment. It may be a pulse, rising, collapsing, resurfacing, each time remembering just enough to rebuild, but never enough to fully understand what came before. The Sumerians were closer to the last collapse than we are, and that proximity made them cautious. We are further away, and that distance makes us confident. That confidence may be misplaced. The same forces that reshaped the world at the end of the last ice age still exist. Climate instability, rising seas, shifting ecosystems. The difference is not that we are immune, but that we believe we are. And belief has never stopped water, fire, or time. The final lesson hidden in the clay is not about gods or lost civilizations. It is about responsibility. The Sumerians believed memory was sacred because forgetting had already destroyed everything once. They treated knowledge as something that could vanish if it was not actively protected. We treat knowledge as something permanent simply because it feels abundant. But abundance is not permanence. One day, long after our cities have eroded into foundations and our languages have splintered into myths, someone may find fragments of what we left behind. They may argue about whether our stories were symbolic or literal. They may misunderstand our intentions. They may debate whether we truly understood the forces we played with. And they will be right to question us. Because if the Sumerians taught us anything, it is this. The most dangerous moment in any civilization is when it forgets that it can fall. The tablets do not ask us to believe in ancient gods. They ask us to remember why knowledge was written down in the first place. Not to celebrate beginnings, but to survive endings.